DHA, the athlete's choice. Heart and brain, let's raise our voice. Muscle recovery will go far with omega-3.
Hello and welcome to the Good Oil, the podcast series dedicated to exploring the impactful role of DHA in nutrition and well-being. I'm your host, Bassam Hallak. Welcome back to part 2 of our discussion on unlocking the power of your omega-3 index. If you haven't listened to part 1, be sure to go back and watch part 1 on YouTube or Spotify. To recap part 1, we discussed and explained what omega-3 index is. We are going to continue today the chat with Lalen and Gregory on measuring the omega-3 index. Let's dive back in. Greg, based on your research, what do we know about omega-3 index in the population? More so in terms of where the population is at in terms of relative to poor and good raised.
Yeah, so that goes back to part 1 where Leyland beautifully described those levels. So omega-3 index under 4, 4 to 8 and above 8. So those are really low levels, suboptimal, and then we eventually arrive at something that we can pretty much be assured that we're taking in optimal levels around that 8 to 12%. Now, what this is representative is a collection of research. It's not just my research. It's not just another researcher. This is a collection of research over the last 20 or 30 years where gradually this knowledge of omega-3 index has been built up over time. And that's because various research studies have collected omega-3 index either as the primary outcome or a secondary outcome. But we've got individuals like Professor Stark, who has been able to collate that and generate what we call a world global map. And what that's been able to do is give us more of a collective picture. Now, we always knew culturally there was certain countries around the world that were doing a pretty good job. So if you think of examples like the Japanese diet, and we know that the marine intake and the fish intake in that diet has culturally been quite high. And if you look at the cardiovascular outcomes for that population over the last half century, they seem to have split away from the rest of the world in certain outcomes. But that's not the case for all of the globe, is it? So using global mapping that we've been able to do, where all of the researchers through all of the individual studies can be put together, we can get a colorized map of the world that shows which countries on average, based on the research that's done there, would land in the below 4, the 4 to 8 and above 8. And what's interesting is that it falls out towards, as I've mentioned, cultural based differences. So again, take another example of the Mediterranean diet, may also include more marine based products. But if we then flick across to countries like the US or even us in Australia, we've got less fish intake, less marine intake on a Western style diet. And so on average, our omega-3 index is lower in those countries. So the map's not complete because not every country has had the omega-3 index collected as a research project at some stage, but certainly we've got 2 or 3 interactions now of these global map papers that are giving us a better feel for which countries are taking in more on average compared to others.
Yeah, it's an interesting and it's an eye-opening sort of data when you or information that you sort of highlight. And Leyland, we, the three of us, are very knowledgeable in terms of omega-3 and especially the benefits of omega-3 to human health. So if we know it and we're trying to be unbiased about it, but why hasn't it been part of the standard medical screening, for example, when you go and see a doctor? Why hasn't it sort of gone mainstream in that sense?
It's a great question. If you look at omega-3s and compare it to other nutrients, it wasn't until the early 1970s, that John Dyberg, who was a Danish researcher, who wanted to investigate why is it that the Greenland Inuit population had a low rate of cardiovascular disease despite consuming a high-fat marine diet. And it was that pioneering research that really established that not all fats are bad for you. So relative speaking, if you compare that omega-3 nutrient, which was discovered in the early 70s, and let's compare that to vitamin D or vitamin A. Now, that was discovered in 1910. Right, so some 60 years before omega-3s. So in many regards, omega-3s is a relatively new discovery. Now, in the past 10 years, we've seen many of the world-leading institutes and organisations officially recognises significant health benefits of omega-3s. This includes the World Health Organization, which a few years ago published one of the most comprehensive meta-analysis that I've read. And they had a really positive outcome for omega-3s, including a range of health conditions where they cited a 25% reduction on cardiovascular disease, 21% reduction in Alzheimer risk, and 22% reduced reduction for diabetes and more. Locally here in Australia, in our neck of the woods, the South Australian Medical and Research Institute has an intervention program where they're screening all pregnant women in South Australia for their omega-3 status. Because based on their research, there is strong evidence, overwhelming evidence, that if you're in the optimal range of the omega-3 index, you will reduce the risk of preterm birth significantly. So this project is funded by the Australian government, and now they're considering rolling this out nationally. This will be the world first, and I suspect that there are other governments that are closely monitoring this intervention program. So I don't think it's a question of if, but more of a question of when this test will be a routine test that's offered by doctors.
Yeah, and it's an interesting point that you talk about testing the pregnant mothers, because recently research has shown that if a pregnant mother has an omega index of 8 or above, then her chances of or incidence of preterms reduces by 40% or more. So it's an important test for a expecting mother to make sure that, and we also know the importance of omega-3 in the development of the brain of the child, especially in the last trimester, which is really critical. So, Greg, just in terms of now looking at the desirable omega-3 range, which we sort of touched on it just earlier, what dietary and supplementation strategies would you recommend someone that really wants to focus on getting their omega-3 index or the concentration of omega-3s in the blood to a level that's desirable?
Yeah, so I think a key point is to point out that there is options, and one of the options is to consider foods, and the other is to consider supplementation. And just like Lalen described in part one when we were talking before, the foods are generally marine-based foods that are containing the preformed EPA and DHA, and so we see the classics like salmon and tuna and mackerel and anchovy and all of those fish products. But don't forget too, from a marine point of view, we've also got algae, and we have to remember part of the food chain is the fish are gaining that omega-3 preformed long chain through algae. So for people that don't like fish or marine-based products or choose a plant-based diet, there is also the option of taking algal type oils. But then from a supplement point of view, we've also got enriched fish oils that are available as well. And it's a really interesting topic too, because just like all the fish contain different proportions of EPA and DHA, depending on where that oil is being produced from, means that we've got different proportions of EPA and DHA. And so we see some examples of supplements that are DHA rich and others that are EPA rich. So it's something for the consumer to keep in mind, that those two fatty acids do have specific roles that we've discovered, and that we always talk about EPA plus DHA, but equally we should be thinking about EPA or DHA in some instances as well. So I think it's a combination of both, but like Lalen described, on an individual basis, some people don't like eating marine products, and then the 2 fish meals per week doesn't necessarily always mean that people arrive at that 8%. Some people may, but a lot of people might not, and so therefore the supplemental oil through a fish-based or alga-based oil does become a alternative that is very useful for raising the omega-3 index.
That's really helpful, Greg. Once someone starts working on increasing their omega-3 intake to have obviously an optimal effect on the omega-3 index, and I think we touched on this before, but I'd like you to dive in a bit deeper. How long does it typically take to reach that desirable level that we want? I know targets are different depending on individuals, but how long does it take?
So there's a couple of key factors, and again, Lalen talked about individual factors like the body mass of the person, the sex of the person. All these factors are relevant, but also if you think about just the omega-3 index, someone who's at 4% getting to 8% will be different to someone who's already at 6 getting to 8. So the baseline is really important. Hence, the amazing sort of insight that a test like this can do, because it actually gives you an idea, where am I currently sitting with my current diet, and what am I looking to do to actually start to achieve better intakes. So baseline status is important. The dose is also important. So the literature would say that if you want to accelerate that a little bit quicker, you can raise the dose. But the other important part is it's all about consistency. So like we talked about before, it's not just simply about consuming the omega-3, getting it into our circulation, which we refer to as the plasma, and it just floats around. We want to present that in the long term, and we're using the red blood cell as a biomarker for all the other tissues. So if we're talking about raising over the long term, we're looking, like we spoke about before, at least 3 months. But what we're actually hoping for is for behavior change for a lifetime. Now, in terms of dose, and it gets back to that global map that we talked about before, and Australia does sit at around about 5% on average, give or take. What we're looking at is trying to just go back to the 5%, that would probably mean on average an average Australian adult's taking in around about 100 to 150 milligrams of EPA plus DHA. So that's why it's quite low on average. I always try and think about what's the first base that we need to get to. And if you have a look at, like Lalen was talking about, the National Heart Foundation, we're talking about 250 milligrams and then 500 milligrams. So the first thing someone should be looking for is, how do I actually increase my omega-3 index on average to 500 milligrams per day? That's what I would see as the first base everyone should be looking at. Now, reality is that is not going to take everybody at 8%. Some people may get there, but a lot of people may not. And so realistically, what we're looking at is somewhere between 500 to 1,000 milligrams per day to get some assurity, depending on your baseline. Did I start at 4, 5, or 6? That we're now encroaching on that 8%. Now, it's an interesting topic because we spoke about before, it's not just putting it in and it stays there. It's being used. It's biologically being used all the time. So that's why we have to keep adding to the bank. And things like physical activity means that we're constantly putting our body through stresses and strains, and we might be activating some of that DHA, for example, to mop up some inflammation. So if you take physically active individuals, and we've done a couple of studies, and I know we've mentioned these in a previous podcast before, if we're talking about Tour de France riders, we observed on average that if they were to maintain anything close or above 8%, it was more like 1,500 milligrams per day. And then we've also done a study with some WNRL St George Illawarra Dragons, so the women's team, and we were looking to look at the individual responses over time. And for those, they were going from a baseline of around about 5, again, Australian average, up to 8%. It was more like 2,000 milligrams per day because they're physically active, they're training, the body's under inflammation, they're having to recover, all these things. The biological activity of DHA and EPA is then meaning that we have to put more into the system. So to summarize, minimum 500, most people should be looking for 500 to 1,000. And then depending on circumstance, and athletes are a great example, it's probably somewhere more closer to 1,500 milligrams per day on average.
When you talk about the athletes having a higher level compared to what we talked about earlier, the 500, is that because they're being so active that they're using some of that omega-3 and burning it as fat? Is that the reason?
So it's not. So again, it's not like a fuel perspective. So yes, athletes use fatty acids for fuel production as well. But remember, there's lots of different fats that they can tap into. But we're talking about specifically for maintaining our membranes, our omega-3 index at 8, 9, 10, hopefully even higher. What we noticed is that for them to do that, and our UCI pro cyclists that we monitored, they were monitored over close to 30 weeks, so the whole season. It was the athletes that said and reported to us, I'm taking my capsules every day and it's 1,500 milligrams per day. They still wasn't amazingly high in terms of 10 or 11, but they were holding around 8.5 or 9. The athletes that didn't engage in that 1,500 milligrams per day, they were more likely to be back down at the 7. So it does tell you that the individual person, in terms of their physical activity, for example, does mean that the omega-3 intake potentially has to be higher than someone in our standard population, where potentially it needs to be, around about 500 to 1,000 on average.
So, Lalen, Greg obviously explains eloquently there in regards to the importance of taking it and how long it takes. So for someone that says, well, okay, I'm already taking supplements,
Mm.
you know, do I need to continue to test going forward to make sure I'm on track?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, and I think outside of the athletes who probably their compliance generally is better. One of the things that we see frequently is that consumers or individuals that are taking omega-3 supplements, you don't always feel a benefit, and
Yeah.
that has an adverse effect on compliance. In other words, they're not daily taking their supplements. There's some exceptions there, maybe for joint pain, maybe for dry eye, but for the most part, you don't necessarily feel that your heart is beating any better than what it was the day before. So, what this test really does provide this individual is not only do you get your own status and all that, and particularly when you do a retest, right? It it validates almost the lifestyle changes that you've made in terms of changing your diet, incorporating more fish into your diet, or possibly omega-3 supplements. And we see a significant improvement in compliance as soon as they know their numbers and as soon as they could see
Yeah.
that the values are increasing and they're more in the whole protective zone.
Greg, you talked earlier about the Japanese and, you know, the amount of seafood that they consume. Is that enough for someone to say in the Western world, say, okay, I'm eating a lot of seafood? Is that enough to get to their desired omega-3 level?
We do see examples that someone can take enough, but on whole, and Layla mentioned this before, it's a combination of the cost of seafood for a lot of individuals, access to seafood. Do I actually like seafood? And we know that 1 in 3 individuals potentially don't even like consuming seafood. So seafood is not going to be the answer for everyone. That is 100% true. So supplements are going to have to be the next best option. And the supplement industry obviously has improved a lot in terms of consumer choice in the last 2 decades or so. And as I mentioned before, we see different types of supplements being available that we've actually got choice now. We can choose EPA or DHA rich. So I think supplements do play a very important role in this process, because the challenge that we've got as a global population is that we have to also consider our targets in terms of our global health, and that includes, you know, our underwater environment. So that's our sea environment, and being able to feed everyone through whole food is challenging. So that's where supplements can create some efficiency around being able to deliver the EPA and the DHA specifically. And I think also it gets back to the point Leyland's making. It's understanding the level that I'm at in terms of my omega-3, but the supplement also gives the individual some more precision on how much am I taking, because when you have your plate of salmon or your can of tuna, it's a bit difficult to actually quite understand how much EPA and DHA is in there, where at least on the back of the supplement, it'll actually say it's this many milligrams of DHA and this many milligrams of EPA. So the consumer can then match that up with their blood sample and get a pretty good feel of where they're individually responding over the longer term. And that gives them more confidence in terms of making an educated decision on how much EPA and DHA is right for them according to their own individual blood test.
Yeah, and this is a common thing that we see a lot, just getting feedback from consumers that have undertaken the test, is that they're taking an omega-3 supplement, they're following the serving sizes on the label, and it may be something like a commodity oil, like we call it, an 1812, which doesn't have much EPA and DHA in there, and they are really disappointed because here they are trying to be proactive about their health, and they've bought a typical supplement, an omega-3 supplement, and only to discover that it contains very low amounts of EPA and DHA. And in the discussions that we have with them, they're extremely motivated, and we explain to them that, hey, look at the EPA and DHA on the label. The higher it is, the higher the dose, then the more faster you're going to get into the desirable range. And in terms of compliance and them going out there and actually replacing the supplement, we've had no issues there at all. In fact, the opportunity there, I think, is more around education, educating these consumers who want to do the right thing but don't necessarily have all the information.
And it doesn't, I mean, if you look at the demographics and the way it's evolving, you know, birth rate is going down. The world birth rate at the moment is 2.3. In most Western countries, it's below 1.8. So it's actually not replacing. And then the average age of populations are growing. Japan's almost 50. China will be 50 in about 5 or 6 years. So then now you're looking at an aging population. what are the key elements that they were going to attract. It's cognitive issues, joint and heart and so forth. So it becomes really that discussion around omega-3 and the importance for the population, and having that sort of well-being is really critical, right? So, and I think this omega-3 index testing is going to be certainly going to be more important going forward, because you've highlighted many times. It's not, you got to take it now to get better tomorrow. It's about taking it now to get better, to have those benefits in 1 month, 2 months, 3 months and onwards.
Yeah, like we refer to it as nutritional preconditioning for the long term. So it's not the quick fix. It's actually looking for the long term in terms of being able to set all of those body systems up to be able to be optimal as we age, is the best way of describing it.
Correct. Well, Lalen and Greg, it's unfortunate we've got to wrap it up now. Thank you so much for coming on today and talking through about this important topic of omega-3 qualification, and in particular omega-3 index.
Excellent. Thanks for having us, Bassam.
And thank you to our audience for tuning in. We hope you found this discussion unlocking the power of omega-3 index. We encourage you to explore the resources we've discussed and consider how they can benefit you. Stay tuned for more DHA episodes. We'll continue to uncover the latest omega-3 science. Until next time, stay healthy and keep pushing your limits.
DHA, the athlete's choice. Heart and brain, let's raise our voice. Muscle recovery will go far. With omega-3, your shining star.